Cornell University, 1947. Richard Feynman stands in front of a blackboard covered with equations, but his hands are still. The chalk rests in the tray. He's not solving anything, not proving anything, not demonstrating anything. He's just looking at the symbols he's written, and there's something in his expression. Not frustration exactly, but a kind of quiet confrontation with the nature of thought itself. Subscribe to keep thinking together, like the video to keep the channel growing, and tell me what this idea meant to you in the comments. The room is empty except for him and the mathematics, and in that emptiness, something fundamental is being worked out, not on the board, in him. Because Feynman understood something about learning that most people spend their entire lives never quite grasping. You cannot force the mind to understand. You can only create the conditions under which understanding becomes possible. And those conditions have almost nothing to do with willpower, discipline, or effort in the way we typically imagine them. They have everything to do with something else entirely, something that looks, from the outside, almost like play. This is not a story about study techniques or productivity hacks. This is not about memorization strategies or time management or any of the surface machinery we associate with learning. This is about something deeper and stranger. The relationship between consciousness and comprehension, between desire and discovery, between forcing and allowing. Feynman spent his life navigating that relationship, and what he found, what he proved through the arc of his own intellectual journey, was that the mind learns best when it is least constrained, most curious, and utterly free from the tyranny of ought. The secret he left behind is not a method, it's a way of being. Let's go back further, Far Rockaway, New York, 1920s. A small boy with dark hair and restless hands sits at a table with his father, Melville. Melville Feynman was not a scientist, not a professor, not an intellectual by training. He sold uniforms. But he understood something essential about the nature of knowledge, and he passed it to his son, not through instruction, but through conversation, through questions, through a refusal to let the boy mistake words for understanding. When young Richard would come home from school and announce proudly that he had learned the name of a bird, say, a brown-throated thrush, Melville would stop him gently and say, "You can know the name of that bird in every language in the world, and when you're finished, you'll know absolutely nothing about the bird. You'll only know something about people, what they call the bird. Now that thrush, how does it behave? What does it do?" This was the first lesson, the foundational one. Knowing the name of something is not the same as understanding it, and the corollary, which Feynman absorbed into his bones. Curiosity begins where naming ends. It begins with the question, why, not the answer, what. This distinction might seem trivial, but it's the hinge on which everything else turns. Most of what we call education is an elaborate system of naming. We teach students to recognize patterns, recite definitions, reproduce solutions. We reward them for knowing that mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell, that the French Revolution began in 1789, that the quadratic formula is negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all over 2a. And students can know all of this, can pass every test, earn every credential, without understanding a single thing. Because understanding is not the accumulation of labels. It's the reconstruction of reality inside your own mind, using your own thoughts, your own connections, your own sense of how things fit together. It's slow, it's inefficient, it often looks like confusion, and it cannot be hurried. Young Feynman learned this not from books, but from radios. He became obsessed with them as a teenager, collecting broken sets from neighbors, taking them apart, rewiring them in his makeshift lab in the family home. He didn't read manuals first. He didn't study schematics. He just opened them up and started touching things, tracing wires, testing circuits, watching what happened when he changed a resistor or swapped a tube. Sometimes he'd fix a radio by accident, through sheer trial and error. Sometimes he'd break it worse. But always he was learning. Not learning about radios in the abstract, but learning how this specific radio, this configuration of metal and wire and electricity, produced sound. He was building a physical intuition, a tactile relationship with the material, and that relationship could not be taught. It could only be experienced. One story captures this perfectly. A man called Feynman to fix his radio, and when Feynman arrived, still a boy, barely a teenager, the man was skeptical. "You're just a kid. What do you know about radios?" But Feynman went to the radio, turned it on, and just stood there, listening, thinking, walking back and forth. The man grew impatient. "What are you doing? You came here to fix the radio, not to pace around." And Feynman said simply, "I'm thinking." He realized that the tubes were heating up in the wrong order, causing interference before the circuit stabilized. So he reversed the order of the tubes, turned the radio back on, and it worked perfectly. The man was astonished. He told everyone, "That kid fixes radios by thinking," as if thinking were some kind of magic trick, some unusual method. But for Feynman, it was the only method. He couldn't fix a radio by following steps. He had to understand what was happening inside it, and understanding required time, attention, and the freedom to be confused. This is where most people go wrong. They encounter confusion and interpret it as failure. They feel the discomfort of not knowing and assume they lack intelligence, discipline, or talent. So they try harder. They force themselves to memorize more, study longer, push through the resistance. But the resistance is not the enemy. The resistance is the material. Confusion is not a sign that learning has failed. It's a sign that learning has begun. The mind is encountering something it doesn't yet have a framework for, and it's trying to build that framework in real time. That process is uncomfortable by definition. It's supposed to be. And when you try to bypass it, when you try to force comprehension through sheer repetition or willpower, you're not accelerating learning, you're preventing it. Feynman encountered this truth again when he arrived at MIT in 1935. For the first time in his life, he was surrounded by people as smart as he was, people who had been the top of their classes, who had solved every problem with ease, and for the first time, he met problems he couldn't solve immediately. Problems that resisted his first approach, his second approach, his 10th approach. He would sit with an equation for hours, trying different methods, getting nowhere, feeling the creeping sense of inadequacy that comes when intelligence meets its own limits. But instead of interpreting this as a personal failing, Feynman began to see it as an invitation. A difficult problem was not a judgment on his abilities. It was an opportunity to develop a new ability, a new way of seeing, a new method of attack. The frustration wasn't something to overcome. It was something to inhabit, to explore, to learn from. Because in that space of not knowing, something essential was happening. His mind was being forced to improvise, to create, to go beyond the tools it already had. This is the paradox of learning. You can't force the mind to understand, but you can force it into situations where understanding becomes necessary. Feynman's method, if you can even call it that, was to deliberately put himself into positions of confusion. At Princeton, where he went for graduate school, he developed a habit that shocked his professors and peers. Whenever he encountered a theory he didn't understand, he wouldn't just read about it. He would try to read it from scratch, pretending he'd never heard of it, imagining he was the first person to think about the problem. He'd ignore the textbooks, ignore the authorities, ignore the established solutions, and just sit with the raw phenomenon until he could build his own explanation. Sometimes his explanation matched the standard one, often it didn't. But always, he understood it in a way that went deeper than memorization, deeper even than comprehension. He owned it. It was his. This approach takes time. It takes patience. It takes a willingness to look stupid, to fail repeatedly, to spend hours on a problem that a textbook could explain in 10 minutes. Most people can't tolerate that. They want the shortcut, the summary, the efficient path. But efficiency is the enemy of understanding. Real learning is not efficient. It's recursive, iterative, often circular. You think you've understood something, then you encounter a new angle and realize you didn't understand it at all. You build a model, test it, watch it fail, and build a better one. This is not a bug in the process. This is the process. And it only works if you're willing to move at the speed of thought, not the speed of instruction. Now, let's talk about what happens in the brain when you try to force learning versus when you allow it. Neuroscience has confirmed what Feynman intuited. The brain does not learn through repetition of meaningless symbols. It learns through the formation of new neural connections, and those connections form most robustly when three conditions are met. First, novelty. The brain pays attention to things that surprise it, that violate expectation, that present a puzzle. The prefrontal cortex, which governs attention, is designed to filter out the predictable and focus on the unexpected. When you encounter something surprising, your brain releases dopamine, a neurotransmitter that doesn't just make you feel good, it also strengthens the neural pathways involved in whatever you were doing when the surprise occurred. This is why you remember exactly where you were when you heard shocking news, but can't remember what you had for breakfast 3 days ago. Your brain is wired to pay attention to novelty, and what you pay attention to is what you remember. Second, emotional engagement. The brain remembers what it cares about, what it finds beautiful, frightening, or fascinating. The amygdala, a small almond-shaped structure deep in the brain, acts as an emotional amplifier for memory. When you're emotionally engaged with something, the amygdala signals to the hippocampus, the brain's memory center, that this information is important and needs to be stored permanently. This is why you can remember the lyrics to songs you heard once but loved, while forgetting formulas you studied for hours but found boring. The difference isn't in the repetition, it's in the emotional charge. The brain doesn't care how many times you've seen something. It cares how much you care about it. And third, autonomy. The brain learns best when it is exploring of its own volition, following its own curiosity, rather than external commands. When you're forced to do something, your brain activates what neuroscientists call the extrinsic motivation system, circuits that respond to rewards and punishments, to carrots and sticks. This system is useful for simple, mechanical tasks, but it actually interferes with complex learning. Why? Because it creates a division in your mind between the task and yourself. You're doing the thing to get the reward, not because the thing itself matters to you. The moment the reward is gone, the motivation evaporates. By contrast, when you're intrinsically motivated, when you're doing something because you want to, your brain activates entirely different circuits, ones associated with curiosity, exploration, and creativity. These circuits are linked to the brain's default mode network, which is active when you're daydreaming, making connections between distant ideas, having insights. When you try to force learning through external pressure, you shut down the very networks that make deep understanding possible. When you try to force memorization, you bypass all three conditions. You eliminate novelty by making the material predictable and boring. The brain habituates to repetition. The 10th time you see the same flashcard, your prefrontal cortex barely registers it. You're not learning. You're rehearsing. You eliminate emotional engagement by making learning a chore, by turning it into something you have to do rather than something you want to do. And you eliminate autonomy by turning the student into a passive recipient of information, someone who's being told what to learn, when to learn it, how to learn it, and what it means. The result is what psychologists call shallow processing. Information that enters short-term memory and vanishes within hours, leaving almost no trace. You can cram for a test, pass it, and a week later not remember a single thing. This isn't a failure of memory, it's a failure of learning. The information never made it past the gates of consciousness. It was processed but not understood, seen but not integrated. Contrast that with what Feynman did. He treated every problem as a novelty, even if it was a solved problem. He never approached something thinking, I already know this. He approached it thinking, what would it be like to discover this for the first time? That mental posture kept his brain in a state of alertness, of surprise, of readiness to learn. He engaged emotionally by only working on things he found genuinely interesting. If a problem bored him, he didn't force himself to work on it. He found a different problem. This wasn't irresponsible, it was psychologically sophisticated. He knew that his brain would learn more in 10 hours of fascinated exploration than in 100 hours of dutiful study. And he maintained complete autonomy over his own thinking process, never deferring to authority, never accepting an explanation just because it came from a textbook or a famous professor. If he didn't understand something, he assumed the explanation was bad, not that he was stupid. So he'd construct his own explanation, test it, refine it, until it made sense to him. The result was deep processing, information that integrated into his existing knowledge structure, that connected to other ideas, that became a permanent part of how he saw the world. This is why Feynman could recall concepts he learned decades earlier with perfect clarity, while most students forget what they studied within a week of the exam. He wasn't smarter. He was learning in a way that aligned with how the brain actually works. There's a famous experiment that illustrates this. Researchers gave students a complex physics problem and divided them into two groups. One group was told they needed to solve the problem because it would be on the final exam. The other group was told nothing about exams. They were just asked to think about the problem because it was interesting. Both groups spent the same amount of time on it. But the second group, the one with no external pressure, performed dramatically better. They found more creative solutions, made fewer errors, and when tested weeks later, they remembered the concepts more accurately. The difference wasn't effort or intelligence. It was motivation. The first group was learning to pass a test. The second group was learning to understand. And understanding, unlike memorization, lasts. But here's where the story gets darker. Los Alamos, 1943, the Manhattan Project. Feynman is no longer a student. He's a physicist working on the most urgent scientific problem in human history, the development of the atomic bomb. The pressure is immense. The stakes are existential. And yet, even here, even under the weight of war and secrecy and moral consequence, Feynman maintains his playful approach. He picks locks for fun, cracks safes, plays bongos, challenges his superiors, all while solving differential equations that will determine the yield of a nuclear explosion. Why? Because he knows that a mind under chronic stress, a mind that cannot play, a mind that is only serious, eventually stops working. Creativity requires slack. It requires the freedom to explore tangents, to waste time, to pursue ideas that have no immediate utility. The brain cannot be productive every second. It needs moments of apparent idleness, because that's when subconscious processing happens, when distant connections form, when insights emerge. Most people misunderstand this. They see Feynman's playfulness and think it's despite his brilliance, a quirk of personality that didn't interfere with his work. But it was the condition of his brilliance. The playfulness wasn't separate from the physics, it was the physics. Because play is what happens when you engage with something for its own sake, without external reward, without concern for outcome. And that state of engagement is the optimal state for learning. When you're playing, you're fully present. You're experimenting, you're taking risks, you're iterating rapidly. You're learning faster than you could through any amount of deliberate study, precisely because you've stopped trying to learn and started trying to understand. And then, after the war, Feynman lost it. He went to Cornell as a professor, and for the first time in his life, he couldn't do physics. The silence was profound. He would sit at his desk, staring at blank paper, and nothing came. No ideas, no excitement, no curiosity. He had spent 4 years at Los Alamos, working under pressure, solving problems because they had to be solved, not because he wanted to solve them. The work had been urgent, necessary, tied to the survival of civilization itself. But that urgency had also been a kind of violence against his natural way of thinking. He had trained himself to work on command, to produce on schedule, to set aside his playful instincts in service of a larger goal, and it worked for a while. The bomb was built. The war was won. But when the pressure was lifted, he discovered he couldn't turn the switch back. He couldn't remember why he'd ever loved physics in the first place. The joy was gone. In its place was a terrible emptiness. He felt burned out, used up, convinced that he would never do anything important again. And the worst part was the expectation. Cornell had hired him because they thought he was brilliant. His colleagues expected great things. Students looked at him as if he had answers, wisdom, insight, and he had nothing to give them. He felt like a fraud. The offers kept coming, positions at other universities, prestigious institutes, promises of reduced teaching loads so he could focus on research. But how could he focus on research when he had no ideas? How could he justify taking a salary for doing nothing? The expectations, well-intentioned as they were, became a prison, because you cannot force yourself to have ideas. You cannot will yourself to be creative. The harder you try, the more the mind seizes up. It's like trying to force yourself to fall asleep. The effort itself is what keeps you awake. This crisis lasted for months. Feynman described it later as a kind of depression, though not in the clinical sense. It was an intellectual depression, a loss of the thing that had always given his life meaning. Without physics, without that constant engagement with reality's puzzles, he didn't know who he was. He went through the motions. He taught his classes. He showed up to faculty meetings. But inside, he felt hollow. And the terrible thing was that he couldn't explain this to anyone. How do you tell people that you can't think, that your mind feels dead, when you're supposed to be one of the smartest people in the world? How do you admit that the very thing that defined you has disappeared, and you have no idea how to get it back? The breakthrough came through a strange grace. Bob Wilson, the head of the laboratory at Cornell, called Feynman into his office one day. Feynman expected another pep talk, another expression of confidence, another reminder of how much was expected of him. But instead, Wilson said something different. He said, "Feynman, you're teaching your classes well. You're doing a good job, and we're very satisfied. Any other expectations we might have are a matter of luck. When we hire a professor, we're taking all the risks. If it comes out good, all right. If it doesn't, too bad. But you shouldn't worry about what you're doing or not doing." The words were simple, but they cut through everything. In that moment, Feynman realized something profound. He had no responsibility to live up to what other people thought he should accomplish. Their expectations were their problem, not his. If they wanted to imagine he was a genius, that was their choice. He didn't have to carry that weight. He could just be himself. And with that realization came another. He remembered why he had started doing physics in the first place. It wasn't to impress anyone. It wasn't to achieve something. It wasn't even to contribute to human knowledge, noble as that sounds. It was because he found it fun. When he was in high school, he would watch water running from a faucet, narrowing as it fell, and wonder if he could figure out what determined that curve. And he would work on it, not because anyone asked him to, not because it would get him into a good college, but because the puzzle intrigued him. That was all. That was enough. He decided, sitting in Wilson's office, that he would go back to that. He would treat physics like play again. If he never accomplished anything important, fine. If he never won any awards, fine. He would just work on whatever interested him, without worrying about importance or impact or what anyone else thought. This is the crisis that many people face, though usually much earlier in life. They try to force themselves to learn something they don't actually care about, for reasons that are external, because they have to pass a test, get a degree, please a parent, earn a promotion. And it doesn't work. Or it works in the shallowest possible sense. They acquire the credential, but not the understanding. They memorize what they need to pass, then forget it immediately, and move on to the next obligation. And they think this is what learning is. They think education is supposed to feel like this, tedious, exhausting, disconnected from anything that matters. And so they conclude that they're not good at learning, that they're not smart, that something is wrong with them. But nothing is wrong with them. They're just trying to do something impossible. You cannot force the mind to care. You can only find what it already cares about and follow that. Feynman found his way out of the crisis by accident. He was sitting in the Cornell cafeteria one day when a student threw a plate into the air. The plate wobbled as it spun, and Feynman noticed that the Cornell medallion on the plate seemed to rotate faster than the wobble itself, and for the first time in months he felt it again, that spark of curiosity. Why was the rotation twice as fast as the wobble? There was no reason he needed to know this. It had no practical application. No one was asking him to solve it, but he wanted to know. So he started calculating. He worked out the motion of the plate, figured out the dynamics, derived the relationship, and it was fun. It was just fun. No pressure, no expectations, no concern for importance. Just the pure pleasure of figuring something out. He went to his colleague Hans Bethe and showed him the solution. Bethe looked at it and said, "That's interesting. But what's the importance of it? Why are you doing it?" And Feynman said, "There is no importance. I'm just doing it for fun." Yours! And that was the turning point, because he had given himself permission to play again. He had stopped trying to be brilliant and started trying to be curious. And as soon as he did that, everything else followed. He went back to problems he'd loved before the war, problems about electron orbits, about quantum mechanics, about the strange behavior of particles. And this time, it was effortless. He wasn't forcing it. He was allowing it. And within a few years, that work, the work he did just for fun, without any concern for its importance, earned him the Nobel Prize. There is a lesson here that goes beyond physics. The mind works best when it's not working, when it's playing, when it's exploring without agenda. This doesn't mean you can't work hard. Feynman worked incredibly hard, but the work came from interest, not obligation. It came from a question he wanted to answer, not a task he had to complete. And that makes all the difference, because when you're interested, effort doesn't feel like effort. Hours pass and you don't notice. You encounter obstacles and they feel like puzzles, not punishments. You fail and you try again, not because you're disciplined, but because you're curious. This is what people mean when they talk about flow, about being in the zone. It's not a technique you can learn. It's a state you enter when you stop trying to force yourself and start following what genuinely fascinates you. By the time Feynman arrived at Caltech in 1951, he had fully internalized this philosophy, and it showed in his teaching. His lectures were famous, not because he simplified things, but because he made them interesting. He never dumbed down. He never patronized. He never hid the complexity of physics or pretended that understanding was easy. But he made it feel possible. He made it feel like the most natural thing in the world to wonder why the sky is blue, or how a magnet works, or what light actually is. He did this through analogies, through thought experiments, through relentless questioning. He would ask the class, "Why do you think light bends when it goes through glass? What's really happening there?" And he would wait. He would let them struggle with it. He wouldn't give the answer too quickly, because he knew that the struggle was the learning. The answer was just the end point. The thinking was where the understanding happened. In one famous lecture, he explained the concept of energy. Most physics courses define energy as the capacity to do work, which is accurate but meaningless to most students. Feynman took a different approach. He imagined a child playing with blocks, stacking them in different configurations. The mother, wanting to teach the child about conservation, counts the blocks at the end of each day to make sure none are lost. One day, she counts 28 blocks instead of 30. She's confused until she notices that 2 are hidden in a box. She can't see them, but she can weigh the box, and from the weight, she can deduce that the blocks are there. Another day, the count is off again. This time, she finds blocks floating in a bathtub. By measuring the water level, she can figure out how many blocks are submerged. Through this story, Feynman illustrates the conservation of energy without ever using the word energy. The blocks are energy. The different hiding places in the box, in the water, are different forms of energy. And the mother's detective work is what physicists do when they track energy transformations. By the end of the story, students understand conservation not as an abstract principle, but as a concrete pattern in reality. This method of teaching required tremendous effort. Feynman didn't just walk into a lecture hall and talk about whatever he felt like. He prepared meticulously, thinking through every analogy, every example, every possible source of confusion. But the preparation wasn't about memorizing facts. It was about understanding the material so deeply that he could explain it in multiple ways, from multiple angles, using different metaphors for different students. He knew that there's no single path to understanding. Some people think visually, some mathematically, some through stories. A good teacher doesn't impose one method. A good teacher offers many doors into the same room and trusts that students will find the one that opens for them. His famous Feynman lectures on physics are a perfect example of this approach. They're not textbooks in the traditional sense. They're not organized for easy memorization, with definitions in boxes and formulas highlighted. They're organized for understanding. Each lecture builds a concept from the ground up, showing you not just what is true, but why it has to be true, how it connects to everything else, what it means. Reading them is like watching someone think out loud. You see the false starts, the corrections, the moments of doubt. You see Feynman consider a question, reject the obvious answer, explore a different path, hit a dead end, back up, and try again. You see how understanding is built piece by piece through questioning and revision, and that's what makes them powerful. They don't just give you knowledge, they show you how to think. But the lectures also reveal something else, Feynman's profound respect for his students. He never assumed they were stupid. He never assumed they couldn't handle complexity. What he assumed was that if they were confused, it was because the explanation was bad, not because they were incapable. This is a radical shift in perspective. Most teachers, when students don't understand something, assume the problem lies with the students. They didn't study enough. They didn't pay attention. They don't have the aptitude. Feynman assumed the problem was his. If students weren't understanding, it meant he hadn't found the right way to explain it yet. So he'd try again, and again, and again, until something clicked. He believed that you couldn't teach someone to understand. You could only create conditions where they might teach themselves. The teacher's job wasn't to transfer information from one brain to another, as if brains were hard drives and knowledge was data. The teacher's job was to ignite curiosity, to pose questions that made students want to figure things out, to model what it looked like to think deeply and honestly about a problem, and then to get out of the way. Because the real work happened inside the student's mind, when they were alone, when they were struggling, when they were trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense yet. That struggle was sacred. You couldn't shortcut it. You had to let it happen. Years later, a former student wrote to Feynman thanking him for a particular lecture that had changed his understanding of physics. Feynman wrote back and said something surprising. "You're thanking me for the wrong thing. I didn't give you the understanding. You gave it to yourself. I just asked the right questions." That humility is revealing. Feynman knew that teaching wasn't about the teacher. It was about the learner. The teacher could set up the conditions, could point toward interesting problems, could remove obstacles. But the understanding itself, that had to come from within. And it only came when the student wanted it, when they were curious enough to seek it, when they were willing to sit with confusion until clarity emerged. This is why so much of modern education fails. We've optimized for efficiency, for coverage, for measurable outcomes. We want students to learn more in less time, to absorb more material, to demonstrate mastery on standardized tests. But in the process, we've eliminated the very conditions that make learning possible. We've eliminated the time to be confused, the space to play, the freedom to pursue tangents. We've turned education into a factory where students are the products and test scores are the quality metrics. And then we wonder why so many students hate learning, why they forget everything they studied, why they can't apply what they've learned to new situations. It's because they never really learned it. They memorized it, they performed it, but they never understood it. Feynman's secret, if there is a secret, is that understanding cannot be forced. It can only be invited. You invite it by following your curiosity. You invite it by giving yourself permission to not know, to be confused, to waste time on problems that have no immediate payoff. You invite it by treating learning as an end in itself, not a means to an end. And most importantly, you invite it by being honest. Honest about what you don't understand. Honest about what confuses you. Honest about what you find boring versus what you find fascinating. Because the mind learns best when it's free from pretense, when it's not trying to impress anyone, when it's just trying to figure something out because it wants to. This honesty extends to how we talk about intelligence. Feynman hated being called a genius. He knew that the label was not just inaccurate, but actively harmful because it suggested that his abilities were innate, unreachable, the result of some genetic gift that ordinary people didn't have. But he didn't believe that. He believed that anyone could learn to think clearly if they were willing to question everything, to tolerate confusion, to follow their curiosity wherever it led. What separated him from others was not raw intelligence. It was persistence. It was the refusal to accept an explanation that didn't make sense. It was the willingness to look stupid, to ask basic questions, to admit when he didn't understand something. And those are choices, not gifts. They're habits of mind that anyone can develop if they're willing to let go of the need to appear smart and embrace the reality of being confused. So what does this mean for you? It means that if you're struggling to learn something, the problem might not be that you're not trying hard enough. The problem might be that you're trying too hard, that you're forcing it, that you're studying out of obligation rather than interest, memorizing rather than understanding, rushing to the answer rather than sitting with the question. It means that the next time you encounter something difficult, instead of pushing through the resistance, you might try leaning into it. Asking yourself, what exactly confuses me here? What assumption am I making that might be wrong? What would I need to understand to make this make sense? And then giving yourself permission to think about it slowly, messily, without concern for whether you're doing it the right way. It means recognizing that learning is not linear. It's not a matter of accumulating facts in a straight line from ignorance to expertise. It's recursive. It's spiral. You understand something partially. Then you revisit it and understand it more deeply. Then you revisit it again and realize your earlier understanding was incomplete. This is not failure. This is how understanding deepens. The mind is not a container to be filled, but a living system to be grown, and growth takes time, patience, and space. It means valuing confusion. When you're confused, it means you're at the edge of your current understanding, which is exactly where learning happens. If you're never confused, you're never learning anything new. You're just rehearsing what you already know. So instead of fleeing confusion, instead of interpreting it as evidence that you're not smart enough, you might treat it as a signal that something interesting is happening, that your mind is encountering something it hasn't figured out yet, and that if you stay with it, something will shift. And it means being selective about what you try to learn. Feynman didn't try to learn everything. He followed his curiosity. He worked on problems that fascinated him and ignored the rest. This wasn't laziness. It was wisdom. Because the mind has finite attention, finite energy, and it's going to learn best when it's engaged with something it actually cares about. So instead of trying to force yourself to master subjects you find boring, you might ask yourself, what do I actually want to understand? What questions keep me up at night? What problems do I find myself thinking about, even when I'm not supposed to? And then pursue those with everything you have, without guilt, without apology, without worrying whether they're practical or impressive or important. Because if they're interesting to you, that's enough. In the end, Feynman's life is a testament to the power of curiosity over ambition, of play over discipline, of understanding over performance. He never set out to win a Nobel Prize. He never tried to be famous. He just wanted to figure things out. And because he gave himself the freedom to follow that desire without constraint, he ended up contributing more to science than most people who spend their lives chasing recognition. Not because he was smarter, because he was freer. The mind learns when it's free, free from pressure, free from judgment, free from the need to prove itself. It learns when it's allowed to wander, to explore, to fail, to play. It learns when it's curious rather than dutiful, interested rather than disciplined, engaged rather than compliant. And the great irony is that when you stop trying to force the mind to learn, when you stop treating learning as a task to be completed or a goal to be achieved, that's when real learning happens. Not because you found some new technique or hack, because you've stopped getting in your own way. So if you can't force your mind to learn, stop forcing it. Stop fighting it. Stop treating it like an enemy that needs to be conquered through willpower and discipline. Instead, listen to it. Notice what it's curious about. Follow that curiosity, not as a strategy, but as an end in itself. Give yourself permission to waste time on things that have no immediate payoff. Give yourself permission to be confused. Give yourself permission to play. Because that's not a distraction from learning. That's what learning is. Feynman understood this from the beginning. It's why he fixed radios by thinking, why he played with wobbling plates, why he approached quantum mechanics like a game. It's why he could do physics at the highest level for 50 years and never lose his enthusiasm, never burn out, never fall into the trap of treating his work as work. Because for him, it was never work. It was always play. And that's the secret. Not a method, not a technique, just the recognition that the mind learns best when it's doing what it loves, and that you can't force it to love anything. You can only set it free and see where it goes. The light works, the equation works, but the mind only works when you stop forcing it and start listening to it.